Dear Professor Cohn, dear colleagues, dear students, it is my pleasure to welcome you to the final lecture of the 2024 edition of his annual research seminar, The Worlds of History, New Perspectives and Debates, a scientific event sponsored by the Center for the History of Society and Culture of the University of Coimbra. In previous sessions, we have hosted a very distinguished group of scholars, such as Sebastian Conrad, Cécile Faumont, Patrick Boucheron, Peter Fidiger-Bang, Serena Ferrante, or James Posket. Professor Samuel Cohn, who is with us today, is a perfect fit for this gallery. He is currently a full professor of medieval history at the University of Glasgow in Scotland, a position he has held since 1995. All over the years, Professor Cohn has demonstrated an exceptional capacity to attract students, just as was the case in medieval universities, which is very unique. Among his PhD students, we can find students from China, like Yushan Zhao, who completed a PhD entitled Leprosy in Medieval China and England, a comparative study, as well as young scholars from Italy, for example, like Francesco Migliazzo, who worked on Gulf networks of foreign officials in Bologna and Romagna, recruitment, careers, and governance in the age of that. Professor Cohn has been a visiting professor at various universities in Europe and in the United States, which shows the impact of his scientific work. While it would be impossible to list all the institutions at which he has held this position, the following examples are worthy of note. He was visiting professor at the American Academy in Rome, here on numerous occasions, at the École des Hautes en Sciences Sociales in Paris, at the Wissenschaftskolleg, the College of the Knowledge in Berlin, at the University of California in Berkeley, at the University degli Studi di Milano in Italy, and at the University of Antwerp in Belgium. In addition to these prestigious positions, he holds the designation of Honorary Fellow of the Institute for Advanced Studies in the Humanities at the University of Edinburgh, Scotland, and Fellow of the Royal Society of Edinburgh. Professor Samuel Cohn is currently one of the most outstanding European medievalists, with a profound interest in the historical study of various Italian cities, which are very rich in medieval historical sources, a phenomenon that is unparalleled in other European contexts. I discussed this topic a little bit ago with Professor Cohn, and he told me that also in Catalonia we have in some places very sources as good as this one in Italy. This demonstrates that he is an archive historian, which is, in my opinion, a very significant merit. In addition to these extensive and multifaced scientific works, Professor Cohn has demonstrated an ability to conceive significant international projects which have received substantial support from the most prestigious scientific founding bodies at the European level. Since 2022, he has been the principal investigator of an ERC advanced grant from the European Research Council with a funding of 2.4 million euros for the study of, it's the title of the project, Art and Inequality in the Shadow of the Black Death. Moreover, since January 2024, he has been a member of a consortium of several European universities that have been awarded an ERC Synergy grant. This project has received a budget of 10 million euros to be distributed over a period of 6 years, and Professor Cohn is serving as one of the co-principal investigators of the project. The central idea of this project is to investigate the enigmas of plague from the Black Death in the 1346-52 into the 20th century, and it combines the biological sciences, natural sciences, and humanities. The project involves researchers from a variety of disciplines, including mathematical modelers, evolutionary biologists, geneticists, climatologists, soil scientists, and historians, specializing in Europe, the Middle East, and Asia. It is a challenging project that is truly interdisciplinary. It has, among many other merits, the ability to make it very clear how the knowledge of the past that top historians produce can be very useful for thinking about the great challenges of the present. As a historian, he has defined himself as someone who explores popular insurrection in medieval and early modern Europe and the history of plague and other diseases from antiquity to the present. In these areas, he has a very impressive track record of publications, especially books, with the most prestigious academic publishers. Among these notable publications, I mention Death and Property in Siena, 1200-1800, published at the Johns Hopkins University Press, Women in the Streets, essays on sex and power in Renaissance Italy, also by Johns Hopkins University Press in 1996, Creating the Florentine State, Peasants and Rebellion, 1348-1434, by Cambridge University Press in 1999, Popular Protest in Late Medieval Europe, Italy, France and Flanders, published by Manchester University Press in 2004. Lust for Liberty, The Politics of Social Revolt in Medieval Europe, 1200-1425, with Harvard University Press in 2006. Cultures of Plague, Medical Thinking at the End of the Renaissance, with Oxford University Press in 2010. Epidemics, Aid and Compassion, from the Plague of Athens to AIDS, Oxford University Press, 2018. Popular Protest and Ideals of Democracy in Late Renaissance Italy, Oxford University Press in 2021. And, to finish, Paradox of Inequality in Renaissance Italy, also by Cambridge University Press in 2021. And for sure, more books will come in the near future. He has published extensively also in a number of esteemed journals, including the Journal of Interdisciplinary History, Past and Present, and Historical Research. And these publications have appeared not only in Anglo-Saxon world. The bibliography of Professor Cohn includes works published in the French Annals, for instance, the Spanish Pedralbes, or the Italian Studi Storici. So we have published quite everywhere in Europe. The research of Professor Cohn revealed his ambitious view of history. Allow me to quote the extract of one of his journal articles, which clearly shows this. The article is titled "The Topography of Medieval Popular Protest," and it appeared in Social History in 2019. It's a relatively long quote, but I think it is important. Assumptions about the topography of popular revolt have been essential in constructing sociological and historical models that demarcate a pre-modern from the modern period. In Charles Tilly's words, the repertoires of collective action before the mid-19th century were parochial, particular, and bifurcated, while afterwards they became cosmopolitan, autonomous, and modular. By relying on primary sources across the Italian peninsula, France, Flanders, and Britain, and for the early modern period across German-speaking regions into Russia, this article shows that the plethora of late medieval revolts were rarely, if ever, confined to a neighborhood or bounded by local religious congregations or family ties. Instead, they were citywide, and the north of the Alps fused alliances with the peasantry and other cities. With popular protest pushing eastward in the early modern period, these long-distant dimensions became more extensive, crossing linguistic boundaries and thousands of kilometers. In addition, this article raises new questions, such as why peasants and urban rebels in Italy, in contrast to Northern Europe, resisted cross-mural alliances, and to what extent late medieval popular insurrection differed from those of the early modern period. The article ends with a call for new models to understand these differences. End of quote. Professor Cohn's historical perspectives are not confined to a local context. Instead, he employs cosmopolitan approach to historical analysis. This approach is exactly how it should be in the 21st century. Professor Cohn, it is a great honor and privilege to have you here with us today at the University of Coimbra, and we are of course very much looking for your lecture. The floor is yours. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Jose, for that very generous and full introduction. As you were introducing me, I sort of thought for maybe the first time the pedagogical reason or advantage of an introduction like that. That it puts the speaker on such a pedestal that when the speaker then doesn't achieve it, then all of you, especially the students, have some feeling of confidence that you can do this just as easily, if not more so. Well, what I want to do today is really, this is a work in progress on this new, relatively new project from the ERC that's about midway in its 5-year period. This, which Jose has already introduced, this art and inequality in the shadow of the Black Death. We're still, however, in the collecting stage, and it is very much an archival-driven project. But now, even earlier, we were having to throw out and make talks and do analytical work on our research, even though we knew that the research as we were going on, would have to be redone once we not only finish the major part for ourselves, but put the stuff together. In other words, we've been working in our own individual silos, although we have meetings and we discuss this sometimes once a week and sometimes once a month. Nonetheless, we are working almost entirely within our own data collections. And I've given my other RAs quite a bit of freedom to do pretty much what they want within certain limits of collecting this data. And the data at this point, we've finished most of Florentine Tuscany, that is the northern part of Tuscany, which in some ways goes to, especially in the north eastern direction, it's larger than Tuscany today. but it doesn't include, and for most of this yet, Pisa and its contado, or its district, or certainly Siena. We have that, but we are now venturing in. I've just finished coding about 2,000 testaments for Siena, and my other, Valentina Costantini, has done the work for Lucca. I have a graduate student who's worked and finished the work for Naples. I've done Rome. We're going to embark on Venice, Milan, and we're working in Catalonia, principally with Barcelona in this wonderful cathedral town, almost a village, Vic, which is just a magnificent set of notarial records. And then we're moving out. I've just hired someone to work on the Dubrovnik, or the Republic of Ragusa, which again, on the other side of Italy, so to balance out this side of Italy from the Dubrovnik archives. Again, almost like Vic in terms of its testamentary records. And one thing that art historians don't ever announce, but when you go and look at their records of commissioning just paintings, for the most part, in architecture, it's still very much in the sort of three canonical areas that Giorgio Vasari set out in the mid to late 16th century, sculpture, painting, and architecture. But what we have found, and what I sort of anticipated earlier, at least until the mid-16th century, testaments by far are the source most often used by documentary art historians for these types of commissions. And you flip a number of pages sometimes with testaments, but if you were looking for actual artist contracts in this period, almost all of your time would be spent flipping pages, which is good for handball and some other sorts of things. It does have transferable skills, but it's not really good for the soul. Now, as the title suggests, this project includes two diverse fields that have never been put together. One is inequality studies, and the other is art history. First, my assertion here, and you can start to lanciare pomodori, to throw tomatoes afterwards, that there are two novel aspects of this project. And so far, I'm sticking to my guns with that. One is in inequality studies, and the other is in art history. They're new approaches, and I would even bless it with a word which is overused, I think, in history and social science, methodology. The inequality is the easiest to push aside, and with art history, I'll spend a little bit more time on arguing my point. Inequality, and I was just I just got back from Leiden for the European Social Science History Conference, and a lot has come out with inequality. It's really quite amazing from the reading I did, which was aggiornamento, is up to date in 2022 when I applied for the grant. But because I've been in the archives, I've really been lacking in reading this material. So in one aspect, it was great to be at this conference. Inequality now forms a principal theme. It was one of the strands of this conference. And the medieval, early modernists almost had the same weight in that conference with inequality as the modernists and the contemporary historians. And what I implied in my application is still the case, I'm convinced, that economics has almost a total monopoly over inequality studies. And secondly, that when another branch or sphere of human activity is brought in to the economics, everything sort of follows similar, parallel trajectories. And I think this is true not only for the pre-modern period, but also for modernists and for contemporary historians, and to a certain extent, a large extent, to present-day social scientists and activists, that this is the case. It doesn't look at the contradictory of how one, especially the economic sphere, can produce another reaction or consequence for spheres such as politics, political status, and culture. So this is one aspect that we're doing. We are studying the paradoxes of this economic period after the Black Death. And one thing, I'll flip to this slide to show these two figures, Picardy, who almost everyone will have heard of, maybe less so for Guido Alfani. But Guido Alfani, with two big ERC grants, has really made an impact. And again, in this conference in Leiden, one saw that one thing he does in the first project is to isolate, but not really to investigate very much, because he and his project were largely modernists, starting from the 16th century into the late 18th century, where it meets up with Picardy's data. But the Black Death is very interesting. It's still the longest period that we can quantify in which the gap between rich and poor did not expand, but narrowed. And what I have seen, and I did this, the first article, the only one on politics for inequality, back, I wrote it, gave a talk on it at the Leeds conference, which was a plenary lecture in 2012, very same time that Alfani began his first ERC grant. And what I found there was this things that people knew about before, but never stated, especially in the context of inequality. That in this period, after the Black Death, was a period of decline for peasants, artisans, and shopkeepers in their political power and citizenship, and their influence in communal governments in particular, for almost everywhere across Italy. One place that I think was exceptional was, in which I don't, you could, again, it was Portugal. Because Portugal's artisan communities, guild involvement, solid involvement, at least in Lisbon, lasted until 1506, and then it was crushed by King Manuel. This was one thing, and one thing I thought about doing an ERC grant about, but then I got interested in culture. Culture, even to this extent, well, how can I quantify culture? And then I worked earlier on last wills and testaments, so I returned to these last wills and testaments. Now for art history, and perhaps I've been going on too long with this. With art history, there is a big change with this project, and it's a simple change. It's to begin with the documents instead of beginning either with the famous artists or with surviving works of art. And this, we're looking at particularly how the inequality or the equality of artisans, shopkeepers, and peasants changes, looking at these surviving works of art and famous artists. You almost cut out that perspective entirely. And what I feel like I've been doing is a material culture when the objects don't appear, when the objects no longer exist. And here, even with the great documentary art historians of the 19th century up to John Sherman in the 21st century, These people who have terrific philological skills, and especially one of my heroes is Gaetano Milanese, who in the 19th century did these multi-volume works. It's hard to imagine how you could do this without a computer. These multi-volume discoveries of documents. But all of them were geared to famous artists or things such in Giorgio Vasari's work, where we know about the object coming from a famous artist, but it no longer survives, so we can't find any reference. We can find references, but no discovery of the objects. So this is, our approach is different. We are starting with the documents, and really at this point, but not for the entirety of the project, we're starting with last wills and testaments. Okay, so just then I realize I'm probably not going as fast as I should, but I'd like to start with examples. Now, I've been all my career a enemy of example history, but then I realized that examples are more fun, at least to begin with. And here, I ask the question, so what? So you're beginning with the documents, and you're looking at all this art that even contemporaries call the clutter, or the mess that you get rid of. Why is it important? Well, I'll just give one example here, and this is the example in the historiography on women as patrons, although I think they should be called matrons, no, but it's usually used the masculine word for some reason. But women as patrons, and this was a very active, very vivacious strand of historiography, particularly in the 1990s, with people like greatest art historians like my friend Julian Gardner, Benjamin Cohn, Louise Bourdieu, and it's principally Catherine King. And although they disagreed with one another on little points, the thrust of this is A, that women were extremely rare in commissioning works of art, and when they did appear, they were women such as Queen Joanna the Mad of Naples, who did extensive commissioning, or very wealthy patrician heads of governments, such as the widow of the Carrara Prince of Padua, Fina Buzzatarina, in the early part of the 15th century. And then they went to explain, well, why was it the case? And you get almost, I probably should be careful here, but really the cliches about this masculine world, they were not allowed to do this. Okay, fine. This is what we get from the surviving works of art. And I'm not going to question the art historians on that ground, on those grounds, because they know the field much better than me. But for the documentation, it's a very different sort of thing. And I could go through the statistics here, but I'll just give an overview. In Florence, for instance, which is not the case everywhere, but about 30% of the testators are women. And it's less in the countryside, slightly more in the cities. But even given their position in certain aspects of commission, women actually exceed men. For instance, in the weaving and textiles, the vestments that are sometimes have figures that are given not to individual priests. What we're studying, I should say, is not all material objects. That would be impossible, and I think, it'd be impossible with this, what we're trying to do with the testaments. We've already accumulated 16,000. And the only way we could do this was narrowing it down to works of art in public places. And those public places in the 12th until the 16th century, 99% of them are sacred places, churches, hospitals, etc. And with this, women with these vestments are not given to individual clerics, but they're given to the altar, along with altar cloths and other protective textile produced goods. Here, even though they are a third of the male testators, they give it more. In other fields, such as in chapels, which cost a lot more money, the men dominate more than their share. In terms of painting, however, they're almost equal. And I'm sure, and maybe you could say, sometimes my eyes don't work so well when I'm looking and thinking about this, but for my PISA data, which I haven't quantified yet, there will be even a greater percentage of women than in Florence and Florentine Tuscany. That's really impressive. One indication of this, too, is that in Pisa, unlike Florence, you almost have, until the takeover of Florence, and especially in the second half of the 15th century, the same percentages of women testators as men testators. And you have many more testators who are married at the time they're writing the testaments than in Florence. In Florence, they really follow the rule that the historian of Genoa said about the Genoese women, that women come of age only when they become widows. I think this is the case we have in Florence, but not in Pisa. So with this, we have of this type of commissioning I'd like to get to the importance of this by pointing to 4 examples. They're not quite random examples, I have to confess, but they are. I was just sort of looking through what I remember as really interesting testaments for some particular reason. And I'll begin with actually someone who is from what we classify, or what I classify as the elites. This is a woman who is married, has one family name, a prestigious family name, but from a very small town in Tuscany, Castelfiorentino. And then the Salvucci family of San Gimignano, which is also an important family. But then I gave a lecture on this for the Italian medievalist and Renaissance society in Edinburgh, and I asked them if anyone in the audience had ever heard of these family names. No one raised their hand. Maybe they were all shy. But the point is, this is a local family. These are local families. These are families who are merchants, but primarily not international merchants. They're not family names like the Bardi, the Perucci, the Medici, the Strozzi, etc. They're not in that ball game at all. And she has, it's not only, and the ones, not only does this woman have interesting and at least 4 important commissions in her testament, but a lot of them are unique, or almost entirely unique. Quickly, she leaves 12 euro, which is not that much money, to do a fresco series of the Virgin Mary. And something I've never heard of before, and maybe in Portugal you have these, but a library in a parish church. Well, the Dominicans, yeah, but a parish church, I've never seen this before. Her second one is much more, and it also has to do with books. Now, women in this period, aren't supposed to be that interested in books. But here's a woman who is very much interested in books, and she commissions to build a library in the cloister of the Dominicans in San Gimignano. And here's something that I haven't seen in any other testament, so far, out of about 10,000 testaments that I've read, not 16, but this is one which emphasizes to store the books with locks and chains, as is a custom to preserve the books for friars' use. So these chain libraries, that's called now, chain libraries, were really very common from this suggestion. And they're even similar, he wants a similar type of construction with these chain libraries. And here's the one that probably is the most famous, the Hereford one in the Cathedral of Hereford. but it's a 1611. And then, with a great embarrassment, and I tried my best to break into the library of the Joanna this morning, but they wouldn't allow me in. I couldn't jump the style. But apparently, this has a section that is also a chain library. Although in the tour books and all, I couldn't find a single mention of this or illustration. But it's later still. It's, the beginning of the 18th century. As far as I know, there's not a single survival for a medieval chain library. There may be. The one that's often said is medieval is the one of the Malateste in Cesena in Italy, but that library is not even constructed until 1454. So when this chain apparatus comes in, who knows? But for me, I'm a Renaissance historian. This ain't the Middle Ages. But this is another. So the third one, in some ways, is the most interesting to me. And this is one of the very few cases of a commission that is not in a sacred place. And the few examples that I've collected, I've never come across one which is actually a pictorial fresco. They are usually just sculpted coats of arms to put over the portal of your palazzo or your house, but that's extraordinarily rare too, that they're houses. They're almost entirely palaces where you have this. And this, I have it up here, the words, it's a painting of St. Dominic, and next to it, this feet a portrait of the testatrice, kneeling, along with the other women keepers of the convent's wardrobe. Now, this is an organization. I asked a lot of the medievalists at Glasgow, what is this? It sort of seems to me like a confraternity, but it's a group of women. They're all women. And they take care of, it seems to me, the laundry of the priests, which, I don't know, they're dealing with the priest's dirty laundry, but it's a whole organization for this. The only place where I've seen any reference to these words, these types of this type of society, is in Ducange, but no real definition of it. And I don't know where to go to turn to find out whether there were other organizations. Certainly not in the Testaments that I found anything like this. Again, it's a different aspect and something that's unique in the Testament so far. And it has also not only this illustration that I have up here of the picture that's to go above the portal of this house. It's not a palazzo, but a house, and it says that this was the house itself was become this meeting house for these women, and she does donate the house to this society. And I'd like to know much more about that society if anyone knows about that. And then one can go on. She has another thing that's really remarkable in this testament. Many of them are very, very small, but she has 52 pious bequests, and some of them, the largest ones, I haven't even mentioned. That's the point for it. I could go on, and I'm going to try and speed up a little bit here. On the other side of the scale, there's this woman in Florence, much earlier, 1300. Who has a panel painting for only 3 lira. And that's not unusual, especially before the Black Death, but even after the Black Death, to find amounts this low. And this is going into the cathedral, or at least it's planned to. And this is equivalent of about 2 months' salary. So it's something that one can eat. Another one is later, and it's 20 lira, but when I try and calculate the differences that are happening in the rates of exchange between florins and lira, and the heavy inflation before the Black Death, which has not been studied by anyone that I know of, at least in Italy. but you can see it in the Testaments. It's lower, but not that much lower. And here we have something that is not unique at all, but fairly rare and interesting. And this is a panel painting in which the testator, this woman testator, sets aside to configure the composition of the painting, of which, not only which figures are to go there, but the order of where they will, who will be on one side and who will be on the other. And I have that up here. Now, women were behind the scenes as commissioners as well. And here I have this example of a woman who, without a family name, it's a testament, of a man, the husband of a woman who's still alive, not identified by occupation or title or anything of that sort, but who has, she appears in the background. She's the executor of the estate and the tutor of his children, and these are the people who then draw up, after the post-mortem of the testator, draw up these contracts and decide who the artist should be, how much the money should be, even if it's stated, and the composition, which sometimes they change, but not dramatically. At least I haven't found one. And in one statement where she gives a bid to be for ecclesiastical, the hospital of Santa Croce, to be maintained there. This is the important thing. So we don't, if it's giving a mattress or something that's being consumed, that doesn't go into our commissioning context. But when it's something that's to be maintained, that they even give penalties if it's not maintained, this is something that rests there. That is a different matter from my perspective, our perspective. And here, clearly, it's left up to his wife to make these decisions. Now, also, I will just assert at this point that in Pisa, this agency of women is even more outstanding. So the aspect now is, yes, it matters very much whether you start with the surviving works of art or you start with the documents. And there's some other fields. Maybe I'm thinking about writing an article on about 3 different fields where this makes a very dramatic difference in how we look at art history. There's another thing, and here, how am I doing with time? Yeah, I made this exist. I haven't been lecturing in the last 3 years on undergraduates, and I've lost a sense of time. I mean, it may just be senility. I made it late.
You used half an hour, more or less.
Half an hour more?
No, you used...
I used it. Okay, so I have about 15 minutes. Here I won't follow the script as much. I won't be Donald Trump either. I won't follow the script at all. I'll try and contain myself. The people have known for a long time that testaments can go very far down the social scale. And often it's the sense that these are usually what are called virtual testaments, in which no money is given at all. But we certainly find that. I found testaments of servants, I found testaments even of ex-slaves. None of the servants or slaves with servants I put that off, but certainly I haven't found any commissions by a slave. But I used to say that, look, this whole area, this stratum of the population, of these marginals, is really not there. It's not a part of our analysis. But by now, having gone through that, there are these exceptions of going down very far, or being very much from different types of marginals. And one is starting with a wool carver, and in Florence in 1368. And in this period, a wool carver is one of these people who is called we call a disenfranchised worker. They have no citizenship. They have no rights to join a guild, and yet he he gives in his testament, he gives a candlestick holder for Florence's largest hospital, Ospedale di Santa Maria Nuova. And he says that on this candlestick holder, which costs, I think it's 1 florin, he says that his family coats of arms need to be painted on it. And this sounds very much to, perhaps not being Italian, as you don't know of Franco Sacchetti, the great satirist, aristocrat with a political influence, who wrote this vicious but very famous and in some ways very wonderful, funny story, classist story of the commissioning by a blacksmith to going up to the bottega, the shop of Giotto, and trying to get him to paint the coats of arms on a shield. And then the whole story takes off, mocking this upstart who thinks he's so grand, he can not only go to Giotto for this work, but can have a coat of arms. Well, with this guy too, well before, Sacchetti's writing around the beginning of the 15th century, and maybe this is nature copying art, but it's the other way around, but I doubt that. That Franco Sacchetti knew about this incident, this testament, but it shows that maybe he's just not inventing this in the air. This person doesn't have a family name, and yet he does this. Another case is the 2 Weaver sisters at the end of this project. Here, weavers in Florence, at least in the 14th and early 15th century, again, unlike in Flanders and places in the north of Italy where they can become large entrepreneurs even, they are disenfranchised workers. At this point, things have changed, and no one studied this change in any detail. But she actually, as a woman, she has she is in a company with 2 brothers, not her brothers, but 2 brothers. And most of her will has to do with how this partnership in this company can go to her nephew, her male nephew. And it's a curious case because it's one where women are hardly ever given their own occupations. We have to take it from their husbands or fathers. And she's no different. She's married to a cimatore, who's a shearer, and but we know from the Testament that she's also a weaver. And she gives this gift, and more than that, another unusual thing comes up. Also in Testaments, having artist's name is extraordinarily rare. That happens later. But in this one, the producer and artist is her sister, who also isn't addressed as a weaver or identified by the notary as a weaver, but she's the one who's going to weave this, and in a very special, specific way. The technique is specified in this testament. Well, we do also have a few women defined by profession, and this is the only woman I've found yet, and I don't think any of my RAs have found it, a testament by a prostitute. And she is in Pisa, so it's based on my new data. She's from Holland, and again, there's unique stuff. Not only is she giving at least 4 commissions in 4 different churches, but there's unique things here. First, in a grave, she has a new watch to construct, and it seems suggestive in the Testament that it's already been started, almost even finished, of a new monumental tomb in the Camposanto of Pisa, the famous Camposanto. But it's a specificity I haven't seen even with big fish, like the Albizzi, who have multiple tombs, with a door and a chamber. And inside the chamber, in this testament, she gives 10 florins, which is a lot for an inscription. It'll be a carved inscription, it'll be sculpture, in which she praises, it's for her life and her soul and that of her heirs. And the heirs are ecclesiastical institution. She's not identified by any husband or any males or females even. She had no friends, no relatives in this testament. She goes on further for other ones, and I think with this oratory, which is not in Pisa, quite a ways out with this tiny little village, it's oratory for all the necessities. And after reading a lot of wills, you know what necessities mean. Necessities means, in this context for an altar, the missal, the books, certainly the vestments to officiate the mass, and the altar cloth and sometimes other cloths. Not necessarily a painting. That's not necessarily a necessity. But that's and then finally the style of a whole testament is all devoted to these pious bequests, but never does she state for her, the cliche that we have, or the phrase we have, ill-gotten gains, or because of the remission of her sins. It's all very positive. It's for her soul. And so I found this a very interesting testament. Now to get to social science, history, and maybe you'll be glad that I don't have much time left, that I'll speed through this, but this is what we do with the statistical side. And what I maintain is that the central hypothesis of this project has been so far so good, although much more complex and differentiated than I imagined. I didn't imagine anything when I was writing the proposal. But before that, we have to get at social stratification, to get at this class nature of these commissions and how they change over time. And here, just very shortly, this was there are a lot of surprises that aren't very good, or where you see too much chaos. But this was something where I was really surprised. First of all, I take only the qualitative evidence that I have from the Testament to stratify these into what I considered four groups. The elites, the middling sorts, which of course is a bad English term, but used really for early modern England. But if you have a better term, please give it to me. Commoners that didn't lie, I don't know. They're not commoners. No, these, I'm sorry. These middling people, these are people like notaries. Some notaries are elites, but most aren't. You can see this. They have a different title. It's Sarah, it's not Miss Sarah, or Dominus. They rarely get this type of mention. And the third are the populi, but populi is a loaded term, but I use it anyway, popolani. These are the commoners. Okay, they're peasants, they're a mixed bag, they're artisans, they're shopkeepers, but not all shopkeepers. Certain people identified by occupations like are wealthier, like the apothecaries. These people can be really up there with the and then even doctors. Doctors can be elites, but they're more often they're professionals. And finally, we do get to, again, based on occupations, these populi, and then the unidentified, and how to deal with that. The first surprise was just how distinctive these groups were, because I have a second grade, and that is the dowries. And I really think in inequality studies, dowries haven't been given their due. I think dowries are even better. They have problems too, don't worry, but they are even better than fiscal records, because you don't have the same degree of corruption. You have advantages for the elites, especially in Florence, but you also, this is an indication of status. And I think with social stratification, we're not talking just about economics. We're talking about status. We're talking about even poor noblemen as elites. So with that, there was this, and I have these statistics up there, a big gap between the elites and the middling sorts, and an even bigger gap between the middling sorts and then the commoners, or whatever you want to call them. And there was a second surprise, which is useful for me for doing the next step in this, and that is the similarities between these commoners and those who aren't identified. And the standard deviation of these two groups are indicative in that there's a greater standard deviation for the common, the unidentified. And this is because it changes over time as well. But these unidentified people, some of them, I think very few or at least, but some of them can be middling sorts, especially from towns. But almost inevitably, in small towns and in villages, no one is identified, or very few. And these tend to be poorer from the countryside then. And here we get to there are tables which I won't bother you with, but you get this sort of, I think it's this type of graph is called a waterfall or something like that. This big difference, and the difference here is not only these gaps, but with the medians, the commoners are wealthier than the unidentified. But with the means, the averages, reflecting this standard deviation, they are slightly more wealthy. But the important thing is they're grouped together as opposed to this other group. Okay, now for these trends. And here, there are really three things I would like to say. How much do I have now? About 5 minutes?
10 minutes.
All right. More work. So one is that the basic thesis of the project was, and still is, that it's during the period after the Black Death, and exactly when is important, and I get different results for it. Just as these artisans and shopkeepers and peasants are getting wealthier, they're getting pushed out, I assume, but certainly their percentage, rather, of per testator is dropping at the same time, just like the political scene. Just as they're getting wealthier, they're getting less power in the political realm, or indirect power, as in the case with Florence, with these new forms of patronage, where if you support the Medici, for instance, they'll give you certain advantages. Sounds like maybe this is relevant. It sounds like Trump today. Sorry, I'm too obsessed. So this is one thing that is happening. This is my opening. This is what this first graph is. What I had in my application, and it's based on a different definition, a much narrower definition of what is art and what is a commission. And then we get that this is for our first annual meeting with this jaw opening, and the jaw is opening later, not right really at 1348, but in the first part of the 15th century, which is interesting because if you look at the little data we have on real wages, which I think is very biased, it's just it's really the lowest groups of artisans, mainly in the construction industry. But nonetheless, for Florence, well, almost all of these studies reside at present in Italy, and there are at least 8 good studies of this. There are hardly any others in the rest of Italy until the 16th century. But nonetheless, in these studies, it's usually between 1400 and 1430 that real wages finally begin to climb. And here's my latest, where the jaws are much more jagged, but with more. This is based on about just under 7,000 testaments. Here, the crossing links go back to this first generation after the Black Death. So the time has switched, but that's just the difference. Here we get this. Another indication of this is the clustering. I mean, Gini coefficients almost always, they were invented to look at wealth and income. But you can look at it for any type of clustering. And here, the clustering is that it's going up pretty solidly from just before or at the time of the Black Death until the end of our investigation. It's not a steady increase, but a fairly steady increase of time. There are other things, though. If we look at the countryside, this downturn in proportional proportional commissions happens really with 1348 itself, and it's much steeper. It's much steeper than we find in the city. And you find a parallel that you get to, and I don't think there's enough study on this
this. I know no systematic study on this. Of just the what's the right word? Evaporation, the disappearance of these middling sorts and the elites within the towns. Carmignano is a town that I assigned myself as a case study, and I assigned others places to the other RAs. And there was a rich culture of notaries, and you were probably not the middling sorts there, but in the context of Carmignano, a town which was fairly wealthy outside of Florence, they were the elites. They disappeared, these notaries, and then to study the notaries, it's very difficult, because even by the 19th century inventory, which is still the best and only inventory we have in detail for Florence, of which over 20,000 notarial books. For that period, all these books that say Carmignano, well, these people who came from Carmignano, but they're not working in Carmignano anymore. They're working in Florence, and sometimes they have patrons like Albizzi, important people. But do you find testaments for Carmignano? Well, 1 or 2, 3 or 4. But still, what we have for these towns is a sharp decline. It looks like it's going up, but there is one exception to all of that, and that's the the market town of Poggibonsi, which is the southernmost part of Florentine Tuscany, near the border with the Chianti and Siena. And here, Poggibonsi is really doing very well. One, it has this community of German workers in the linen industry. And from those testaments, I can see all these networks between this community, and I can see the wealth. These people are really giving dowries to their wives or their daughters that are almost on par with notaries in the same period in the mid-15th century. Nobody has studied this. In fact, the last book written on Poggibonsi before the 19th century, and then there's good stuff because Poggibonsi also goes up with its textiles then. But that book was written in 1856, and I can't find it anywhere. I doubt it goes into this, but maybe. But then you see, it's even with my case studies, if we take Poggibonsi out, it's much sharper, this decline. Another, and I won't dwell on this, is Rome. And Rome is very different. These towns are very different. And here, I sort of differ from my friend Guido Alfani with these inequality studies. He sort of brags and wants to have everything, what he calls monotonic, all over Europe. Everything's doing the same thing. He's actually broken away from that now, but he won't admit it. But you can see it at this conference last week. Monotonic, I mean, to me in Jericho, it means boring. But anyway, what we find here is something that's not boring, and that the Roman elite is a much bigger gap from it. It really doesn't have that local manufacturing community that, say, we have in Florence or even in Pisa. 85% of the elites that are categorized in Rome are the nobility. In Florence, it's 18%. And you see this big gap, quite unlike in the commissioning before the Black, before the Black Death. It's hard to look at some, I won't go into the documentary differences. But in Florence, if we go back to this graph of Florence, it's, which one of these graphs, oops. It's even these unidentified, we put them together with they are commissioning more than the elites. The elites, and then the elites are really prodded in to this great opening up of the jaws in the atmosphere of this threat that comes across, and his by Baudelaire interpretation. But I had the interpretation before I read Baudelaire. Baudelaire, and that is that they are really how to be distinctive in other fields where they have more power than in economics, where they haven't learnt yet how to rig the economy in times of vicious plagues. They learned that in the 17th century. So I think that instead of concluding, I could, but I think I'll shut up.
Okay. Thank you very much, Professor Cohn, for this for the presentation of this fascinating ongoing project. We are looking very much forward for the final results of it. A lecture, plenty of information, new ideas, different methodologies to approach this matter of inequality, which is very interesting. And now we have room for questions. Please feel free to intervene. You can do that in English, in Italian, not in Portuguese, but
Purtroppo.
please, who wants to start? Amélia, faz favor.
I'm going to start. My English is not the best, but only to say that, well, to thank you very much for your lecture, for all impressive data you share with us. I think I need some hours to reflect on everything you told us, but only to put some. I would like to put two questions. The first one is for a pedagogical approach. When you, for our students, when you told us that the testaments are the best sources to this research, and that we could not do this research regarding the remain art piece. What could you tell us more on this? Well, can you at least have some comparison between the commissions in the testaments and some art piece which remained or not? Something like that.
Yeah.
And the other one, well, is I get a little anxious when I saw the graphics, because what we see there is the decline of all the fulgurant Italian urban government, well, that rise during the 12th, 13th centuries, and all the artisans and shopkeepers are declining after the Black Death and the crisis. So, as I know that you like to work until the present, what can we reflect a little on what we can expect now after the COVID-19? Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Do you prefer to answer immediately, or we
Yeah,
collect
because
more?
I'll forget. I'm getting of a certain.
Okay, please, Professor.
So all the testaments, they do have some liabilities, that's for sure. But I think a lot of things that are really important compared to what one does with attributions, for instance, from the surviving works of art without any documents, which is very common, and it's done by style. And, maybe an artist had a bad day. How do you date these things? And how do you assign this to an individual unless there's something like a coat of arms and art historians, and very clever mechanisms, but I'm insecure about those. Whereas one thing that is terrific about these testaments, if not about their production exactly, and I have a few examples of this, but in terms of their commissioning and the ideas behind them and the zeal for them and their weight, these things are dated to the day. We also know who they are. Usually the notaries give you even the so-called socially my so-called, I'm calling them that, unidentified, often they're identified very well in terms of where they've lived, if they're especially widows, sometimes up to 3 different places where they've been, where they've lived, where they came from, where their husbands are from, and other things they say. So there are real advantages there. And I think you get a different type of record. And it's a different type of record that has some liabilities as well. So, I'll go on to the other. With COVID-19, I think when COVID-19 was happening, a lot of people were talking about, well, this will be like the Black Death, and they should have known better from early modern history that this wouldn't be. One, the demographic shock, okay, it was pretty terrible, but we're talking about certainly almost everywhere, less than 2% of the population. It's not the knock-on of a pandemic where in some cases, were up to 75%. So it didn't have this. And then 2, the elites have learned how to manipulate this. And here I go back to Alfani's stuff, even though I don't agree with it all, but his work on the 17th century plagues in the 1630s and the 1650s, that there was this moment, in some places a little longer, but not even for a generation. We're talking about 5 or 6 years, and then with an inheritance system and others, the elites had figured out how to keep their inequality moving along. Does that answer your question? Thank you.
Okay, thank you. More questions? Por favor. Leonor in surname. A PhD student.
Thanks.
Well, thank you so much for the presentation. I really enjoyed it. It has many points connects to my own research. I have a question that is kind of 2 questions. So the first one is, in your experience with studying testaments, have you noticed a difference in the way men and women write their wills or have them written? Mm-hmm. But also, have you noticed, in the case of women, if there is a difference between married women, widows, and single women? Not so much in the sense of who they leave their assets to, because, if someone who has children will most definitely leave it to their children, but just in the way that they are written, the priorities, sort of, if you've noticed a difference in those. Thank you so much.
First of all, we do have wills in the vernacular, but in this period, they're very rare. In cases, like Serena Glasgow maintains that these were actually written by women, and she's done the most work I know of anyone on books written by women. It certainly has the most recent work on it. Her book just came out, which is really very good, on the Ricordanze, in mainly Florence, but across Italy, where she discovered just under 200 Ricordanze written by women, whereas previously, because of the work of Christian Clapiche-Joubert, we knew about 11. So a big difference, a big finding. And so they did, but it's you don't see much difference there because we don't have big enough numbers, and most of the handwritten ones are by men. In terms of the testaments, it depends where you are, and I think this is important. And what the biggest comparison I have is Pisa and Florence, where in Florence, hardly any wives. I had the one example of a wife doing this commissioning. One of my 4 examples. But it's extraordinarily rare, hardly any commissions at all. And usually they only can give a testament in Florence if they have the consent of their husbands. So it's part of one of the great ironies, and I don't see why people haven't, in legal history, the Renaissance has to do, what was the Renaissance in law in places like Tuscany? It was the decline of Roman law in favor of early medieval law, Lombard law, where the rules particularly govern women's property, women's rights in drawing up any type of notarial documents were much narrower than in Roman law, and especially on the maintenance of their estates and what they do with them. So when you get women's testaments, there's something over 10% of the women's testaments are by women, they're really boring because they just do what their husbands tell them to do. And it's clear. They say, here, he's the universal heir. You sort of even wonder why they're bothering writing the testament. But what you get from the widow's wills is something that I think is very interesting. It's been noted before, but I think much more can be done with it. Women, I calculated, and from the difficulties of calculating total wealth with testaments, is people say impossible. Actually, in one of my examples, there was a case where it was possible. I didn't go on it, but and you find this in other testaments too. If you leave all the property to the male, your children, your male heirs, and then down the masculine line. But if they all die without reproducing, then, and it goes on to saying 350 florins, which is this is the one from this little town, market town of Santa Croce. That's a lot of money. Goes to, in fact, one of these monasteries within Santa Croce. So you can do this. But at any rate, even though women, my calculation, they have about a third of the resources that we can monetize as men, they have more choice over their property. Because the men see it as channeling most of their goods down to their sons or their universal heirs, whoever they may be. Whereas the women get around that, and they have more pious, you see a bigger network of friends, or who knows, maybe some cases I really do suspect lovers, but maybe I'm dreaming. Well, I'm sort of thinking I have to give a lecture to a group of, again, cultural history, but society in Scotland, which is based on the estate of a famous Scottish novelist who I had never heard of, and most people haven't, but she made a lot of money from her novels. And so part of the thing will be, maybe there should be a methodology of how we fill in the gaps. And this is one gap. And in some cases, Valentina Costantino has found a really nice story where this is without doubt the case. But they have these much broader networks, and also, even more importantly, within their pious bequests. They generally make more pious bequests than men, even though the amounts are lower. Sorry to go on, but it's a good question. Like thinking.
Thank you very much. Sorry, Maria Helena.
Thank you for your conference. I'm sorry about my English. And I was thinking Portuguese. You speak about the Italian cities, and I speak about Portugal. All Portugal has a few testaments that one town of Italy.
In all Portugal there are less testaments than in just one town in Tuscany.
This is the first.
But do you have testaments before the Black Death in Portugal?
Yes, many testaments before, during the year 3048, a few, 10, 15.
And these are in parchments kept by churches?
Parchments.
Yeah, none in notarial.
But yes, some testaments in the epoch 1360, it was the plague. The second plague. I was thinking about that, and the thing more interesting that to do in Portugal, not yet done, it was the problem of textiles of the women, in the testaments of women, the problem of the textiles.
Of the textiles.
Textiles,
yeah.
If you can make a comparative thing, men there's more than women, or women than men, because I think this was a thing of women's.
I agree.
Put towel in the...
It's especially, we're quantifying the ones that are pious bequests, and you're absolutely right. That in fact, the women even have more of these gifts in Florence, even though they represent only a third of the Testaments. They have more of these types of textiles. And there's other differences too, which are curious with textiles. One, they go much more into the technology, the type of materials, the type of weave even, and colors. For some reason with paintings, all these things, even these detailed ones, like the one I gave with the composition of 5 different figures, and no colors. But with textiles, you have color.
Yes, I was thinking we don't do yet that work, but it is important. And to see not only the testaments, but obituaries.
There's one exception, though, with the men. If we start looking at their testaments, I wonder how the statistics would stack up, because men go into a lot of detail with textiles when they talk about the settlements for their widows and what is going to the widow. And widows don't do the same to men. That's extraordinarily rare. So it's the balance may be different if you looked at the non-pious bequests. And the same thing goes for gems and for jewelry. And,
yes.
So it's an interesting question. But textiles, my first paper on this was given to the court hall, and it was on textiles. But then it's really Serena Galasso and Valentina Costantini who have really gone off. They're very much interested in women in textiles. So watch this space for their work, not for mine.
Thank you. Any more questions? Please feel free to intervene. I can add 2 more questions if you don't
and then I'm going to add. Can I add a comment that I left out after you?
No. Please, if you want to
no,
use that comment.
Okay. It's one thing in the conclusion that given the sort of mandate for this talk, as I understood it, maybe I misunderstood it, was one, it should be somewhat methodological, which I tried, but also in debates. And I think this work opens up a big debate that really hasn't been addressed. It's gone from one side or one sort of group of scholars to another, and I think we're intervening against the current wisdom. And this has to do with the whole scale of what is changing with the so-called Renaissance in the 15th century, the last decade of the 14th and 15th century. And the dominant thesis today is someone I was very close to, an economic historian who probably did more in economic history in the last 100 years than anyone, Richard Goldsmith, who just passed away, for really Florentine research, but writ large, he writes it largely for at least all of Italy. And the other, less, who really follows Goldsmith, is another very famous economic historian, Arnold S. in Rome. And both of them seem that neither one of them are Marxist historians, far from it in the case of Goldsmith, but they really have an economic determinism, that what the Renaissance was really all about was all of this ground-up purchasing power that comes with the Black Death. These people, these artisans getting wealthier so that you now have this new base. And so there was much more production of art in the later period. Now they're looking at a lot different, a bigger picture of art than I am, but they're not looking at it quantitatively. And what we had already, going back to Martin Wangernagel in 1938, was a different sort of thing. And even though he'd had no statistical evidence, he actually did. I mean, even though he doesn't use statistics, I mean, for an art historian then would have been really amazing. But he has gone through these inventories, and his best work, I think, is on the Dominican temple in Florence of San Domenico, where he sees that this place was into the 15th century filled with this, what he calls pretty much junk, all this clutter, and then this new aesthetic. It has nothing to do with society or class, to be sure, but this new sort of regime of aesthetics comes in, where the Renaissance ideal of the whitewashed Greek temple, and so they whitewash all this stuff. And I believe, but it's curious, even Esk, the German, doesn't even mention Wackernagel, who is really important in his own time, but even later. And so I think we're going back to Wackernagel. that actually, it's the other way around, that this whole sort of production, particularly is, at least for public places, is in great decline and even being destroyed. This is another thesis of iconoclasm. Sorry.
No problem at all. Thank you. I have two very different questions. The first one is more linked to the research that I'm doing now. I'm very much concerned now in studying the relations between the Portuguese episcopate and slavery in early modern period. You mentioned that you found slaves in some of the wills and testaments that you used. So the question is, from where were they, slaves? From when the wills were made, and does these wills, these testaments, reveals us anything special about their lives? And the second question is related with your projects.
Okay.
I was very much impressed about the originality and let's say grandeur of especially your Synergy grant, which involves mathematicians, geneticists, climatologists, historians. So first question, how did you choose your team? What kind of criteria did you apply to constitute this team? And the second one, because this is a very interdisciplinary project, how do you communicate among yourselves? What type of discussions do you have with these mathematicians, geneticists, and especially how did they react and use the type of information that historians produce regarding this?
Yeah. Okay, so that's just. I thought the question would be about how I chose the people for the art project. No, okay, those are the interesting questions. First of all, with slaves, it's probably disappointing. I think I found 5. Maybe that's even exaggerating, 4 or 5. And they don't tell you very much, but one or two of them.
Were they Africans or Muslims? You don't know.
I think they were called Tartars, and but some may be. One definitely is. This talks about a black slave, so that's interesting. They're very short. Well, I guess the one thing, and I'm reflecting probably only on one. There's a great relationship with their padrone that at least that comes across in the will, which is probably not typical. But you get much more from the famule. First of all, almost all of these testaments are by women, and with the servants too, they're almost entirely by women. And there, with the famule, the servants, or the serviente, I have more there. There's more to be said. And serviente could mean slave in some contexts, but you can't. The other one, schiavo or schiava is clear. So there's not much that one can do. But
and
maybe
these testaments were from the 15th century?
No, late 14th, 15th.
Late 14th?
Yeah, even. And there are sort of one thing I noticed that quite a few are from, quite a few, I don't have many, but maybe I'm thinking of the famule too, but they come from Pisa, where they're less wealthy than in Florence, but it may have to do with their seafaring connections. And my sense from hearing from others is that you get a lot more from Venice. So I think being a part of the seafaring economy is, you have more slaves, but there's certainly slaves coming to Florence. And they're manumitted, that's the big, when the other side of the story is what people give to their slaves. And there I have more. And most of the things are even dowries. And here you find really good relations. Almost all men meant free liberation. So there, but when we get to all the data together, we could do a little bit of a little study on slaves and slaves and servants. That would be a good point to do. Back to the synergy grant. Let me clarify one thing. I was one of the originators of this grant almost a decade ago, maybe it's 8 years ago. So, but I had to drop out. I'm no longer a co-PI. I had to make a choice in 2022 by the ERC. Which grant did I want to apply for? And so I gambled and decided, well, I'd rather be my own boss. And so I took that and let the synergy. And sure enough, that year we didn't get it. We got it the second year. We came close, but no cigar. we got, and then the second, there was a lot of, we've written at least three articles together, and particularly writing up this grant is a big operation in itself. And we had heated debates, particularly between myself and the entomologist and the people who wanted to do it this whole conception, which I find, working with scientists is great. I really enjoy it, and people like the entomologist is from Lille, and he's someone who's a real character. He gets in fist fights on the road and things like that. And he's had Yersinia pestis. He plays around with dangerous fleas and all this sort of stuff. So you don't want to mess with him too much. But at any rate, one thing that surprises me about the scientists from this small sample is that they really have this mindset, and everything's got to fit. And the mindset, of course, with plague is, it follows from what we know from the science today. But then you look at the historical documentation, and it doesn't. I'm now reviewing a new book by an economic historian, and still all this stuff about fleas and rats and all this, with no explanation or sense of. But what this group is doing is finally recognizing the historical documentation. I think if not the first time, at least in a fundamental way in the first time, that something strange is happening. First of all, they talk all about contagion, and this new book I'm reading on the plane and all is all about contagion. But wait a minute, the third, what we call, perhaps it's a misnomer, the third pandemic, it's hardly contagious at all. I mean, pneumonic plague is extraordinarily rare. It never creates a really big one. I mean, the biggest one was in Siberia in 1911, and which is much of the affected area is at 2% of mortality. It's just not. This is not a highly contagious disease, but in the Middle Ages it is, and we know it. We know it from a lot of different sources. And in the old days, the people said, but there are all these drunken friars and writing this stuff up. What did they know? So we can't trust them. So we trust this model coming from the present. It's really what E.P. Thompson called, this arrogance of the present weighing on the past. And now our group is not doing that. We're open question. We finished this piece that I think is very good, that I did with the soil scientists and all. We're finding, for instance, one fact, by doing all this work with soil and the architecture of these burrows for all sorts of different rodents, that Europe is rather distinctive, and unlike the Middle East, unlike Asia, unlike California, Arizona, the soil is not adapted to long-term burrows of rats or of any rodents, nor to husband the types of rats that are the most efficient in carrying this bacterium. And so they're different things. So our group has gotten rid of rats, but they haven't gotten rid of the fleas yet. I'm trying to convince them to get rid of the fleas because this is such a rapid disease. I've written a piece that I hope will get published as soon. It's about how the word in contagion really explodes in importance. It's there earlier, even with Galen, but it's very seldom used by doctors or to be found in chronicles. And after 1348 and during 1340, all of a sudden this becomes a household term. And what they mean by contagion is pretty clear. It's person to person. It's not the only way, but yeah. So I don't know. Yes.
Thank you very much. Any more questions? No?
I could also talk about how the criteria I use for my project.
Thank you very much, Sir
Thanks
Cohn, for
having
being
me.
here. It was a pleasure hosting you here in Coimbra.
For
And
me
please
too.
share me in an applause.